All right, my friends, we're back in action and once again, and now it is time to do chapter, oops, 7. Chapter 7, big highlights for chapter 7. We did a lot in class today. Let's talk about it a little bit more in terms of what it is. Think of it this way in terms of how to remember a few of the things coming out of it. This is the first time we're going to be dealing with, oh my gosh, my penmanship's terrible. The first time we're going to be dealing with nation building. That is awful. I have to get my handwriting back up to speed by practicing a little bit more. It's the first time we're nation building. For the last 12 years or so, we've been talking about tearing a nation down, redoing a nation, creating a nation. Now we're going to start building it. Right out the gate, here's kind of what you can expect to kind of like remember. One of the key concepts of the early part of our history is that financial conditions are really poor at the beginning. Of course, the main reason is we just got out of a war. Our lenders are not trusting us to pay us back. We're a new country. We're very small. A few things in our favor. Our population is doubling every 20 years. So every 20 years, you have twice as many people as you had before. And that's kind of a new concept that we see happening here in these new colonies. And then the other thing that I kind of mentioned, or I haven't mentioned much of, is what is our jobs? And you have to remember that in the early days, 90% of this 3 million population is farmers. And only 10%, if that, are going to be what you would call mercantile city dwellers, urbanites that are going to be living in Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Charleston, Baltimore, that kind of a situation. A lot of people think of us as, of course, backwards because we are frontiers folk. The frontier kind of defines us. But if you also think about this, more than 90% of us are east of the Appalachian Mountains. Appalachia. Oh gosh, that's terrible. Okay. 90% of us are east of Appalachia. So that's kind of a misnomer for us because we always think of us as frontier folk, but there's not that many people going into the Ohio Valley, taking over and, hacking out a life in the wilderness. GW, George Washington, is crucial here. He is the guy that sets forward all of the precedents. This is key that I spell this correctly for you. So you see it. Precedents. Yeah, he's the first true president, not the first one in terms of like history, because we also had the Articles presidents, but he's going to set down all of the rules regarding who runs the job and also who follows whose orders and such stuff like that. He's kind of a mythical figure now, but in terms of historical terms, he was probably the most trusted individual coming out of the French Indian and the colonial wars. He's probably the most trusted individual. He's probably one of the wealthier individuals. And as a result of that, people look to him to set a standard that he would put into play. A lot of people don't know this or remember this, but New York City is the first capital of the United States. He's sworn in on Wall Street, believe it or not. In New York City, there is no capital. It's the first capital. And while he's president, Capitol with an O. While he's president, they're going to be building Washington, D.C. And this is where the French architect is going to be called in, and they're going to create the city to make it have wide avenues and boulevards that are angled in sometimes parallel form. It kind of looks like Paris. And that's kind of where it goes from this. A few notable members of his first cabinet. The key one, or the key ones, where's my pen? There we go. The key ones to remember, of course, is Jefferson is your first Secretary of State. He's going to be putting himself into position as the diplomat for the country. He's very much aligned with France, even though they're going through a revolution. He's a Francophile. He loves that. His main nemesis, by the way, who's going to challenge his way of thinking and also, what goes on in terms of what happens, is whoa, too far. Sorry. His main nemesis is going to be Alexander Hamilton. Together, they're going to create the two-party system philosophically, and Hamilton is, of course, Secretary of Treasury, and he comes up with his Hamilton plan, which I'll review with you in just a second. And Secretary of War Henry Knox. You go down the list. Vice President, of course, John Adams. And they're going to follow a chain of command that eventually might have brought Hamilton to the White House, but he will not make it for reasons that we'll talk about in the next chapter. More specifically, Aaron Burr. That guy Aaron Burr. What's up with him? No, get rid of this. Click. One of the things that was added to the early form of government was the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights have 10 amendments attached to it. It was a promise that was fulfilled by the founders. They didn't have to, but I guess they did. They got 2/3 of the Congress to adopt it, then 3/4 of the states to ratify. They were ratified in 1791. If that's something you want to remember for future reference in terms of timing. 1787 was Constitutional Convention, 1791. So within that little space of time, we've got our first government of the United States. So here's a review of some of these that you might want to consider useful for you in the next couple of months, because we talk about them a lot. We talk about, that's too far. We talk about the Bill of Rights as it applies to government and action, and also what happens when we have questions regarding them. But the First Amendment has 5 parts to it. It's known as the Freedom Amendment, right? So the first one is religion in terms of its exercise. That was the crucial one that goes way back to Jefferson's Virginia. I can't remember the name now. The Virginia, you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. The Virginia Amendment, I think it was called. I have to look that back up. That's embarrassing. It's just going blank on me right there. But free exercise was crucial in the early day. And then there was a second religion component, which tried to create no establishment of one faith. However, religion is intimately tied with everything. So don't think that it's just a complete separation. It's going to be blended in different ways. That's kind of the key misunderstanding that a lot of people have. The next one is speech. The question is, how much do you have? How free is that speech? The next one is assembly, getting together, protesting, telling people that you don't like what's going on. And the last one is the right to a free press. And that, of course, was crucial under understanding of the revolutionary time period and what was going on with that. So free press / petition. I guess free speech, free press is kind of the same thing, but it's the petition element that we're talking about here. The right that you can tell your government what's going on. In fact, I would move free press up into speech. They're almost the same thing. But a lot of people kind of call them different things, even though they're not. All right, that's the first. Second had to do with having a militia. And the way it reads, of course, is the right to bear arms. But it's not just individuals. It was designed to be constructing a citizens' militia. But it's a weapons statute, and who has access and why. That's kind of where the second comes from. Third is one of the most obscure ones. It's the Quartering Act all over again, but we will not quarter soldiers in our houses. That was kind of a Revolutionary War throwback. The Fourth Amendment is crucial for later police work because it has to do with searches and seizures. How do you get evidence? How do you get it? It's not seizures. Seizure. Search and seizure. So how do you get a hold of people's evidence? How do you come about that? The Fifth Amendment was important in that it provided something that's called due process, which guarantees an individual that you will go in front of a process, a procedure, some kind of court setting. You just won't just be thrown in jail without charge. And that was the idea behind it. It also protected an individual from the double prosecution of a crime if one is found innocent at the first trial, and that's called double jeopardy. Jeopardy. Sorry about that. My misspelling right there. Jeopardy. All right, sweet. And that kind of falls right in there. That's an O, not an A. There you go. So that's fifth. Going over to the sixth. The Sixth Amendment was the guarantee to a proper trial or trial procedures. The Seventh Amendment is going to be guaranteeing that you have a jury that's going to judge you. An Eighth Amendment was looking at your punishment, so they throw this cruel and unusual thing in here, which of course is our determination as humans, what is cruel, what is unusual in terms of punishment. It also prevented you from excessive or high bails that would be placed on you and forbid you to be free while you're awaiting trial. Now, the 9th and the 10th were the all-encompassing stopgaps. The 9th basically says if it's not in the Constitution, it doesn't mean that people don't retain rights that are not enumerated or written down. So people have rights. People are protected because, let's face it, we don't know if there's going to be an internet in the future, but if there is, we should adopt a rule about your own individual rights. And then the last one, the 10th, protected states' rights. States' rights from government involvement from a federal level. And it also reserves rights to the states. Like, if it's not in the Constitution, it doesn't mean we can't do it. So, for instance, like a speed limit, a drinking law, a drinking age, all of those are part of that concept and what that works in terms of what it is. And that's the most important thing. I don't want to see you. No, thank you. One of the things that Washington will sign into law is Congress passes the Judiciary Act of 1789. And this is going to establish your Supreme Court. It's also going to establish your court system at the federal level. The first Justice of the Supreme Court, Chief Justice, is John Jay, who's one of your founding fathers. John Jay is going to be your Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And as a way of kind of like comparing how the court's going to develop over time, there wasn't a whole lot to decide in the early phases because we were just establishing all the rules, and that was kind of how it looked, and that's also how it went and worked. All right, sweet. So what's the deal with Hamilton? Hamilton's an interesting guy. He's actually a British citizen, born in the British West Indies, probably to a wealthy sugar plantation family. Moved to the colonies when he was a young man. Was a very young man when he rose up through the ranks of government. Was looked upon as being elite, arrogant, haughty, kind of one of those individuals who doesn't make a lot of friends, but has a very headstrong way of looking at life and how he's going to do it. And the four-part plan that he's going to devise, which is going to become known as Hamilton's plan, is an early way of looking at how the government's going to try to kind of get itself into the game of being a power. So the first concept we talked about today was, pay all the debts. But don't pay them partially, pay them in full. Pay debts in full so people trust us. That's the key, beginning of our economic system that's going to keep us going. Let's put a tariff or a tax on imports because those imports are cutting into American industry and our American ingenuity. And then third, we need a little bit of a revenue supply, so let's put a tax on whiskey and see what happens when that goes down. Then the last thing was we needed a uniform system of keeping it all together, so of course the national bank works out nicely for that. This Hamilton plan, of course, made a lot of people happy because it provided stability that we weren't having before in the Articles of Confederation. But unfortunately for others, it looked as one more example of the government getting too powerful too quick, and that's where that's where it sets up its concept. This is also where you start to see the Jefferson versus Hamilton divide, and it's really a question of whose government do you want. Do you want a large, powerful, spell it. You want a large, powerful, flexible government on a national level that's able to handle problems and able to manipulate systems? Or do you want a more local, citizen-based system where the power is diffused but is there when needed? So if we need it, we use it. But if we don't need it, of course, leave it at the local level. And that was the idea. Now, where is Washington in this debate? Washington, my friends, is right here, and he's taking from both. He's not going to do too much for either one, but when needed, Washington will be the one that's going to hold it all together for his first 2 terms. When Adams comes in, he starts to lean towards one side, towards the Hamilton side, and of course Jefferson's going to counteract by running against him, and that's the way it goes. You're going to start to have a 2-party system in play as that looks. Leave it alone. The Windows Basic, it's fine. Okay, now we're down here. Okay, sweet. So you'll hear this a lot when you talk about like how to interpret the Constitution, because the Constitution does not have all of the rules in it. It's not like a rule book that has all of the ideas in it. So here's where we introduce the concept of loose versus strict, or in another way of thinking about it, how do you see the law in terms of the way it's interpreted, or how do you see the law the way it's written? Loose interpretation means you're allowed to create, what's the best word for it? You're allowed to create connections that aren't really there in the words, but these connections can be interpreted, and they can be, I guess that's the best way to kind of describe it, interpreted and also adapted to changes that aren't foreseen when they wrote it. Strict is just literal. If it's in there, it exists. If it's not there, it does not exist. Therefore, it is very, I guess the best way to put it, it's very rigid in terms of its interpretation. If it doesn't say anything about the internet, then don't do anything about the internet. Just don't even talk about it. So one of the things that's going to be happening over time is, where is the balancing act going to be taking place between the people who are going to be making the laws and the people going to be interpreting the laws. So in the end, Hamilton got a lot of his things in play. He got his bank in play for 20 years. He got the tax put in on whiskey. Of course, the key thing with the Whiskey Rebellion, remember, my big theme about the Whiskey Rebellion is that the Whiskey Rebellion shows that the federal government has teeth, that the federal government means business. And it's also a way of looking at the federal government as being dependable and also reliable to manage crises. It's a crises-based government in many cases, the federal government. Congress makes the rules. It's the way the president interprets them. That's going to be the key that sets it all up at the same time. Outside issues happening that are shaping things up. There's the beginning of a divide. So these factions are going to create political parties. We didn't see that coming. That was something we did not foresee when we created the Constitution. The second thing that you notice is that the French Revolution is going on. French Revolution is huge in terms of the way we see our problems here, because we interpret that French Revolution as a way of kind of measuring our own people and our own situation here. And then the last thing is this new form of trade that's beginning is kind of creating an industrial revolution in England and the rest of Europe. And being that we are the raw materials base, we are starting to play a huge role in that. And the question is, do we industrialize, or do we just supply the raw material end of things? And how is that going to work? Washington's whole deal is to stay neutral, and that was his hope. Stay neutral, stay out of everybody's business, and don't allow Don't allow the Europeans to dominate us. But the second thing he warned us about was, political parties are really a problem, because in many ways they create disagreement, which slows down the government. But in another way of thinking, that's a good thing, because now you have arguments that are going to be able to get to a compromise, hopefully, or deals that are not going to be so much in favor of one side or the other. And that's kind of a nice addition with that. Leave me alone. On the other hand, the British are pushing our buttons, because the British are still trying to combat against the French. And when Napoleon comes into power, right around the time of the next chapter's reading, it's really going to be a war between the French and the rest of Europe, and we're going to be caught in the middle of it. The British still don't treat us, with a lot of respect, but the impressment of our sailors is one of the key arguments we have about, like, hey, you're not treating us with a lot of fairness. You're just pushing us around. But there's nothing really we can do about it. Washington leaves after 2 terms. He warns us about alliances. He warns us about political parties. John Adams takes over. Unfortunately for John Adams, he's just dealing with a world that's having too much going on at the same time. He's going to have difficulty, of course, with the XYZ affair. He's going to have difficulty managing this two-party split that's coming. The two parties are starting to divide him up in terms of his power base and also what he can do in Congress. And along the other ways of looking at it, it just looks like things are just kind of flowing towards a conclusion that's not going to be very positive. The Alien and Sedition Acts was more or less a political weapon to get rid of people speaking out against the government. It's going to challenge our question about like due process and law, because everybody was an alien who's over the age of 12. Let's put it that way. You know, if you were 20 years old, you were born in England, because we were a colony at that time. So the question, of course, is whose alliances are we going to be treating, and that was one of the first challenges to our freedom as we looked at that one. But as the French and the British start their quasi-war, start their war with our quasi-war, and as they seize our warships and they get us all angry about the situation, it just pushes us towards a conflict which is yet to resolve. It's yet to resolve yet. So we end up pretty much now at a spot where things are kind of moving. The Sedition Act, the Alien Act are put into play, and we start to see this idea of states' rights. And it's a states' rights versus federalism concept. And you're starting to hear words like nullification, like I'm not going to follow your rules because I don't agree with them. You're going to start to also hear ideas like interposition, like I'm going to put myself ahead of the national government because our state is more significant. Interposition. There you go. And those arguments are going to carry all the way down to the Civil War. You're going to hear them a lot, especially when we talk about the growth of slavery and the growth of the Southern economy and the Northern economy being split up so much the way they like it. But here's the deal. When you come down to the end of the day, the Federalists look a lot like what you would consider to be modern-day Democrats, except back in this time period, here's the key differences between Federalists and Republicans. Federalists are led by Hamilton, the Hamiltonians. The Hamiltons. I don't think I need to put the S on Hamilton. Let me erase that. Okay, thank you. Go back to the pen. Hamilton, yes. So they were led by Hamilton. They are mostly coming out of the wealthy classes from the North, and we're looking at industry becoming, and commerce, industry and commerce being the key links between the classes that are kind of joining up with this party in terms of what they want, what they're doing. A lot of bankers, a lot of manufacturers, a lot of people on the East Coast, east/north part of the country, and they trusted the educated elite. They looked at the educated elite as being the group that's going to run everything, that's going to do it for the betterment of everybody else anyway, because everybody else is needing some kind of support, and that's kind of how it works. These new groups that are forming along the lines of Thomas Jefferson's philosophy at first were called Democratic Republicans, which can be confusing. But if you just call them Republicans, it makes sense because they're kind of like today's Republicans in some ways, in terms of what they wanted. Now, their head honcho was Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's idea was for the country to be run by educated farmers. That the farmer is the person who is most in touch with what's going on, because he's in touch with the land, he's in touch with nature, and he knows how things work in a way that being educated by a university wouldn't teach you. So he said, do both. Be a farmer, but also be educated at a university if you can afford it. And he's the one who created the University of Virginia. So that's the idea about that. He also said it's not about systems, it's about common sense in some cases, that we don't need to have systems running the show for us. We simply need to kind of like rely on our own ideas more than anything else. And his leadership was centered in what we would call the rural South and West. As we start gravitating west, there would be more of that mindset there as what that was. And they were also very pro-French, just probably because Jefferson was pro-French so much. So that was one of the ideas about that one in terms of how that kind of looked. When the election comes down, like I mentioned today, It came down to the pass where the Democrat-Republicans win. One of the main reasons is that Adams just couldn't solve certain problems during his presidency, and the popular sentiment was kind of against him. He was also kind of a grump. I don't know if that was actually, going to be part of his downfall. There's a great miniseries out of HBO called Adams. You can check it out on Amazon if you want to look at that. But it's kind of an interesting way. But the revolution of 1800 was a revolution for many reasons. But the most important reason it was a revolution was it was your first true two-party split or two-party election. And remember, the controversy of the Burr-Jefferson tie was kind of important because of that. Okay, good. Let me put a little E on that one, not a C. There you go. Oh, I keep making it look funky. All right, and that's kind of where we left off. And when you read next time, you're going to take off right away in the early days of the Jefferson presidency, and we're going to talk about how it will affect the courts, how it will affect our international relations, and more importantly, what's going to happen to our internal development, our internal growth. These are the three big themes coming out of the next chapter. If you pay attention to those early, you'll see those show up a lot. And that's it. So thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you had a good week and you had some good reading and everything was going great. But this is a quick review of Chapter 7 out of the Nordhoff High School AP U.S. History textbook. Have a great day. Talk to you later. Bye. All right, my friends, we're back again for Chapter 9, Transformation of American Society. The delay for Chapter 8 was mostly given in class during the time when I was going over the court cases and what was happening with those. Chapter 9 is a good chapter. I like it a lot. The thing about Chapter 9 that I think is interesting or unique in the way it's done is it's talking about how America is changing, of course, but I think there's two main ways it's changing in terms of how it's going through the process of the change. The first concept, let's see, where's my pen? Is it working? Oh, I gotta turn it on, hang on. My bad, my cough. One of the ways it's changing is it's changing its location. Our location is, of course, shifting across from east to west. That's kind of the nice thing to remember. The second way it's changing is we're changing our identity. And that's coming from a few factors, but most importantly, it's coming from the blending of these new people that is moving into the frontier. And that's, I think, a difference that we start seeing here. So let's go Chapter 9. Chapter 9. Okay. So one of the key things is this concept of frontier. The frontier is, I think, a huge psychological advantage to being an American. I don't know any other place, advantage, not adventure, advantage. I don't know of any other place where the frontier has been so strongly associated with life and the prospects of future. I think the fact is that because we have this concept that we can open up something that is new, something that has not been touched before, I think we have the mindset that even though we don't usually do it, we have the possibility of advancement. We have the possibility of moving into a new position of income or position in power. And I think this advancement concept is something that's truly uniquely American. I think it's something that you don't see very often, especially because that's the way it kind of sets itself up. One second. Okay, friends, so here's a key statistic for you in terms of thinking about this. By about 1835, 1840, you're looking at 1/3 of the population of the United States now west of the Appalachian Mountains. This is going to be a huge change in our perception of who we are, but also what we can do. It's in many ways a safety valve for us because we don't have a lot of class issues in terms of competition between the classes, because we're pretty much offering free land to a lot of the folks who could just get to it. And that alone is worth its weight in gold in terms of keeping people stable in terms of a society. But it also gives them the mindset that, hey, I can move up. And I don't know if that's possible. Like I say, it's probably harder to move up than it is to move down. But in a lot of the cases, it's just not that easy to kind of like, document. So the person who kind of sees this and is making his commentary, de Tocqueville, am I spelling it right? No, I did it wrong. Let's erase that. Where's the eraser? All right, sweet. So de Tocqueville. Come on, don't do that. De Tocqueville. And I apologize for my penmanship. De Tocqueville, the French guy, he's commenting on a couple of things. He looks at us, interestingly enough, as half wild, half civilized. That's his commentary. And the reason, of course, is he sees us in our rugged lifestyles, but he also sees us moving up in terms of power and also in terms of politics and economics. I think the key thing he sees is that we have this perception, and it's not reality, because it's not reality. We have this perception of equality because we're not equal. The elites, of course, have a tremendous advantage over everybody else. But we have a perception of equality where we think we can move, we think we can compete. And one of the, I don't know if it's one of the, but we see this identity of being self-made, that you can hack yourself out of the wilderness and you can make yourself more profitable. We also see this interesting concept of education, going back to the concepts of the Enlightenment and the thinking that even though we're not born equal, we have the concepts of equality kind of built into us via natural rights. Those two alone are going to do wonders to create a new identity for the United States. And the United States, of course, is developing this as we go into these years of westward expansion. And it is about going into the West. I mean, the key part about this thought process is that the West is the place where you can make your dreams come true. Although most of the West is a desert, most of the West is not really accessible to most productivity at this point. It hasn't been tapped with transportation. It hasn't been tapped with civilization. That's kind of what's happening in that kind of concept. So this self-made concept is best exemplified, like I said, by these individuals who are going to go off and hack themselves out of the wilderness, and we describe them as mountain men. There was also women involved in the journeys as well, but these were the early trailblazers, I suppose, is the best way to describe it, which is what they call them, the trailblazers, the ones who went first. And these mountain men, Jim Bridger, Zebulon Pike, they went across these barriers, these huge barriers, Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, Sierra Nevadas. And what they were looking for, of course, was a way to get themselves wealthy. A lot of it was based on the fur trade of the time period. But they were also making connections with natives. They were also making connections with the education of, like, where do you go from here to there? How does that work? And now, once we have this westward settlement, now we have this idea that we have to civilize it. And by civilizing it, we're going to try to create systems that are going to hopefully, manipulate it. So the Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to come up with the idea of how to divide it up into grids, and the grids are going to allow it to give it a shape. And a lot of the western states in the middle of the country have the same shape or the similar shape in terms of size, and that's kind of the gift of that. The Northwest Ordinance, which of course these two come in the Articles of Confederation time, and that's 1787. Northwest Ordinance is pretty significant in that it's creating a process, the process to move from a territory into a state where you can have taxes, you can have organizational systems, you can have everything else put into play. These two are thrown into hyper overdrive by the development, or I guess the best word is not development, but the acquisition of the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana Purchase is going to create this huge drive west, and it's going to create this never-ending mindset that we can keep developing out there as long as we have the open land to get a hold of. And the Louisiana Purchase is part of that idea, how that works and how that shapes itself up and how that goes around in terms of what it does. All right. So if you're a settler, this is a good thing. However, if you're a native, this is awful. You are continually being pushed from east to west. Most of the natives in this time period are going to be, or actually it should look like this, east to west. You got it. Most of the natives by this time period have been decimated by disease and warfare. Most of the native cultures have been put on the edge of survival and wiped out. One group in particular, the five civilized tribes. The five civilized tribes attempted to create the mentality of, if you can't beat them, join them. And they began to assimilate pretty easily. They started to intermarry. We had intermarriage with a lot of the white European culture of the time period. They started to adopt the culture. They started to adopt the language. And as a result of that, a lot of the five civilized tribes, by the time of, I guess, the mid-1820s, they found themselves in a position where they were trying to fit in more than fit out, if that makes sense. Around this time period, in the next chapter, you're going to heavily hear a lot about Andy Jackson. And Andrew Jackson is an interesting figure. The key thing about Andrew Jackson is that he is going to increase the president's power. No president since Washington is going to have a definition of power or an expansion of it like Andrew Jackson. The thing about Andrew Jackson that's kind of like, I don't know if it's missed, but here's the key thing. He really benefits from a widening of the popular vote, because during his presidency, we're going to move from that rule of white men with property to what's called universal manhood suffrage. Now, not all men could vote. Of course, they would divide by color. But the idea about universal manhood suffrage was that now we have a pool of individuals that are going to represent all the classes. So, as you know, probably in logical terms, there is a lot more of the poor and the middle class than there are of the wealthy. And this is going to change the dynamic of not only politics, but also how we play the game of politics. And Andrew Jackson is going to ride into a wave of popular support based on the concept that the poor middle class of the western states are going to give him the victory over the elites of the East, the landowners of the East that have been dominating all the way through, since the beginning. Now, for instance, John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams, which is kind of wild in the sense that, you have this transition of power between father and son. But more importantly, he was an elite, he was an aristocrat from the Revolutionary period, and Jackson represents the first breakout of the middle class, or what we call the common man. Okay, that's the first thing. The second thing is that if you really think about it, politics is really about satisfying the voter. And if you can't satisfy the voters in a majority, you're not going to find yourself winning. And what Jackson realized was that his majority was of the lower middle class of the West and the South. And what does the man of the West and the South want? What does the voter of the West and the South want? He wants more land. In fact, he would love free land. And what's the key cash crop that's making this, prolifically profitable? It's cotton. So in Congress and in the presidency, there was a push to open up the land. So this puts the five civilized tribes in the crossfires. The key tribe, the most civilized of them all, I suppose, in terms of their size and their power, was the Cherokee Nation. And the Cherokee Nation sat in what is today commonly Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, and I think if we go up to Tennessee, it might have reached as far as that. They were kind of a tribe that sat in most of what is today, not the lowland South, but it would be called the Pine Barren South, and they were clearing the pine barrens and opening up cotton plantations, and it was highly desirable that they have that land opened up. Well, Congress, without President Jackson's veto, Congress passed something called the Indian Removal Act. Where am I at? Here we go. Removal Act. And interestingly enough, the question is a native a citizen? Are they a citizen? If they are not a citizen, do they enjoy the same protections under the law as a person who, claims citizenship underneath, I guess the best way to put it is the Constitution, but there is no citizenship clause in the Constitution yet. So the question is, of course, what makes a citizen? So as they're looking for a solution to this, Andrew Jackson capitalizes on this. He uses it as a political weapon. The idea is that during his first term in office, there will be several court cases that will challenge this. The court cases are notable for the fact that they're Federalist courts still, and the Federalist Court usually rules on behalf of the Federalist government. But here's what's interesting. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and that's not California, that's Georgia, and in Worcester versus Georgia. Worcester versus Georgia. Once again, I made California there. Weird. Both court cases are being run by Marshall. You would think that he would side in behalf of the federal government. But what's ironic is that he picks the side of the Cherokees in most of the court cases. He looks at them as a domestic dependent nation, a kind of a protectorate of the United States, and it backs up their claim that the lands that they have are theirs, and it protects them from a federal attack or federal invasion. And John Marshall is going to take the side of the natives. He's going to say these natives deserve constitutional protection, and they should be protected. Now, the problem, of course, is that there is a few issues that develop because of that. Sorry for the interruption. So one of the things that comes out of this is Jackson stubbornly refuses to follow the order. I think there's a quote, and I can't be sure if it's an actual quote or if it's something that's a summary of something else that somebody said, but I think Jackson states that Marshall made his decision, let's see him enforce it. Meaning, whose job is it to enforce the law? The problem is that it's the executive branch's job, the president's job, to enforce the law. And if the executive doesn't do anything, it doesn't matter what the Supreme Court says, nothing will get done. So if you ignore the ruling, the question is, who's going to be picking up the power? Now, Congress is not against the president because the Congress and the president belong to the same political mindset, same political party. So they don't care. So now what happens is that the president is going to use his power to enforce this ruling, but he's not going to enforce it in behalf of the Supreme Court. He's going to enforce it on behalf of what Congress wants. And what's going to result, of course, is something they call the Trail of Tears. And it's another 1/3, fact again. 1/3 of all of these folks on this journey are going to die. And they're going to be traveling between the east coast of the United States, and they're going to end up in a territory that later on will be claimed again by white settlers. And that, of course, will be Oklahoma, which was the original territorial zone for natives. Oklahoma, not Oklahoma. All right, perfect. And sadly but surely, they are going to disappear into history, and that's going to be one of the last large groups that is able to either resist or even fit in to European culture. A few things are going to start to develop agriculture here. I mean, think of it this way. You can grow your crops, but can you move them? That's one of the major problems of the Great Plains and the eastern Mississippi River valleys. The agricultural zones of the country are going to benefit, of course, from canals. Now, canals are mule-driven, horse-driven waterways, and they're going to be able to move, of course, goods between bodies of water. So if you have a lake on one side and a river on the other, between the water supplies, you're going to be able to move your goods, which I think is a nice thing to have. I can't believe I wrote it like that, sorry. The second thing is that we have new technologies. The steam engine is a crucial development here. Now, we're not the ones that invent the railroad. We're not the ones that are going to devise what rails are. But the railroad is one of the new devisements of creating a waterway on land. And that's something you start to see. And, of course, they mentioned Fulton's steamboat. Fulton's steamboat is going to transform the interior of the country because now you can move stuff both up and down the Mississippi River's tributaries, and that's going to be a tremendous boost. And what you have is you have a system of trade that's going to be able to move goods long distances into markets where they never could get before. They would never be able to get them there. I mean, for instance, if you don't have a steamboat, all you can do is go down the Mississippi. So what do? You build a barge, you sail it down the Mississippi, you leave it in New Orleans. I think New Orleans was overflowing with barges they couldn't get them back up the river. So then you hook up a paddle wheel to it that's steam powered, and you're good to go. So as all of this is happening, we're starting to see this develop. And on the side note, we also have some machines that are helping out. The Reaper of McCormick's Reaper is going to it's going to develop a new, faster way of agricultural production. And we're going to start to see machines take over the agricultural zones of the Midwest coming in the next century. As soon as we start getting, of course, internal combustion engines running on gas, but that's something else coming down the way. So there's two forms of agriculture. There's commercial, and your job in commercial ag is, of course, to sell your crop and make a profit. Wheat is a great commercial crop, because you can't eat all of it, let's put it that way. You couldn't make enough wheat to make enough bread to kind of survive on, because there's just a surplus of that. So wheat's a great one. Another great one that's talked about a lot is, of course, cotton. Cotton is one of those that kind of gets us, thinking about the South a little bit and how that works. Excuse me. But that's commercial ag. Then there's subsistence ag. Subsistence means you're self-providing. And you're self-providing because, let's put it this way, there's nowhere to get your stuff from. There's no stores, there's no neighbors, there's just you on your own. And self-providing agriculture is probably how most people in the United States, most of them were surviving with pretty much until after the Civil War, until we had markets that could be moved by rail and connect the country together. But those two things are huge, and that's going to be a big change in the way we see everything and everybody else. With this new development of business, agricultural business, there's this huge drive to speculate on land. And land speculation is going to be one of the more dangerous pastimes for the economy. And what it's going to create, of course, is going to create the Panic of 1819. It's going to create other problems between states and between trade markets. But here's the key concept. They're guessing, they're banking that they can get out there and make more money if they can open up more land. One of the consequences of that is that the more you have of something, the price starts dropping. So if you guess wrong and everybody starts growing wheat at the same time, well, the problem is that the price of wheat comes down, you don't make as much money. So it's kind of a gamble, and that's why it's a dangerous system for people to kind of involve themselves with. But this transportation revolution we're talking about is another place where people are speculating. And the transportation revolution has a unique idea where you take public funds, and what you see is the public is going to pay for it with taxes, but the benefit is going to hopefully come back to the consumer, because all of the costs of moving things are going to start dropping. It's kind of what they think of when they think of, like, well, if we gave everybody free internet, what would that do? Well, that would increase people's productivity. If we gave everybody a public transportation system that was cheaper than cars, what would that do? Well, it would save us the income on cars, so we wouldn't be spending it there, we'd spend it somewhere else. So it's trying to stimulate the economy a little bit. And the revolution, of course, the investments are pretty interesting. The Erie Canal is the first major investment, and it pays itself off, I think, within 2 years, if I'm not mistaken. The investors get back like 600-800% in 2 years, which is just crazy numbers. But then again, think about it. That's the only way you can move goods cheap enough by transportation to make it worth it. Another one that's unique and powerful about that is the National Road. The National Road is the same idea. If we all have a good road, and we all can get there from point A to point B faster, remember, time equals money. If you can do it fast, you save money. And that's, I think, a big development to think about when you have that. And then the last one, the most expensive of them all, was creating something out of nothing, which is the railroad. And that is a very huge investment that many people in this time in history just don't have the access to the funds for it. So you don't see a lot about that. One of the key stimuluses for this is going to be the Embargo Act. So the Embargo Act is bad for us, but you might say it's the best thing that ever happened to us. Because without these things, none of these things are going to be, invested in and taken off. And that's kind of why it's not there, and that's not why it's not developing it. The Embargo Act is also going to pressure our new industry, and our new industry is starting in the north, and it's textile driven, because textiles, let's face it, everybody needs them, everybody needs to wear them. But the key thing is that we make all the raw materials right here. And if the raw materials are here, think about the cost. If you can keep it here in terms of production, it's going to drop down. So we start to cut into England's manufacturing market. And I think we mentioned the Lowell and Waltham mills. Lowell and Waltham. That investment team put together the first true mill in the country. It was water powered. But remember, he was an industrial spy who stole the idea piece by piece in his brain and brought it over to the United States and basically transported the English system over here, which I think is totally unique. A lot of folks at this time are still what you would call artisans. They're making everything by hand, and of course that increases the cost. The first unions, believe it or not, are designed to protect artisans from factories. Because, let's face it, if your factory can pump out 20 shoes and I can only make a pair a day, I'm going to lose my job. So artisans started to kind of bind themselves together to fix prices. At the beginning, it was fixing prices so we could have the same profit from shoemaker to shoemaker. And later on, these unions are going to transform themselves into the hands of the workers. And remember, the first strike in the United States is the Lowell strike. And the Lowell strike is going to come when most of the young women and also some of the employees who are men are going to step up and they're going to demand better wages and better conditions. Because let's face it, the owner's incentive is to keep everything cost low. If I have to clean up, if I have to make it safe, it costs me money. So the workers and the owners have to do this delicate balance of I need to produce, but I also need to develop an idea about that. In 1835 also, there was a coal miner strike, and the coal miners, it's hard being a coal miner, let's put it that way. I think we're lucky that we're not living in a coal miner zone of the country. But coal miners is just a hard way of living, and they would often overwork them, so they demanded a 10-hour workday, which was an improvement over their 12 to 14-hour workday. And those are the changes that are being demanded by the workers, because guess what? Here's the formula. Workers are the majority of your voters. Voters influence the selection of your politicians. Politicians will not survive unless they create policy that makes the voters happy. If they can't do that, they lose their job. So the workers begin to organize in different ways politically, and most importantly, they're starting to do that in the job itself. There is an inequality. There always has been an inequality between wealthy and poor. But here's the thing that I think is different between us and everybody else, is that we have a perception that we can be socially mobile, which, to put it simply, we believe we can move up. Now, it might not happen. It might be very hard. But you see stories all the time of people that have nothing and move up. You see this development happening in our culture today, and this is where it's coming from in this time period. And this is also a reason why we become an immigration destination. The Irish, when they immigrated, they had a lot of choices, I suppose. But there's only one choice to kind of like make it where you can actually get ahead at the start when you're poor and you're coming and you're dying from starvation. But there's also this concept of if you can get there, you can move yourself out of that place and into a better place. And maybe it won't happen for you, but it'll happen for your kids. The inequality is also racial. We have a tremendous amount of discrimination, even in the North, where you're going to have freed black slaves. Of course, this is going to be the concept of, what happens when a person leaves the southern plantation and gets out. Well, you've got all kinds of things. You've got discrimination, you've got prejudice, you've got all kinds of treatments that are going to be, detrimental based on racial association. That's kind of what's happening there. But then, of course, you've got the southern slave. And the southern slave is entering the dark ages now, because the southern slave, here's the problem. In 1808, they cut off the slave trade. Now, when you ban slavery, here's the problem. You have no new inputs except for those that you can manipulate from the inside out. I think this changes us a bit. I think this makes us more, I don't know how to put it, more racially biased and more racially negative towards each other, because here's the situation. If I lose a slave, if a slave escapes, well, the simple solution is to import them. Import a new slave. Okay, fine. I got a new slave. The problem is now, with no new imports, is you have to really manipulate your slave population. You have to really get aggressive in terms of how you manage who they are, but also how they work, how they survive, and also you're starting to go deep into the family structure now, which is just dark and twisted. So now you start looking at this and you start seeing things happening, and that's of course a big change in what's going on. In the cities now, you're starting to see a burgeoning middle class. I describe the middle class perhaps as the people who get into what you call management positions. They're not the owners, but they're the ones that run the show for the owners in many different positions in societies. And with education increasing the ranks of the educated elite, education is now pushing people into different ideas. So one of the key things that this starts happening is that people start to leave the farm. And I know this is sounding sad, but farm life is hard. And you've seen this trend happening all the way back to the 1820s where people start saying, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to get myself a job. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to make my life better. Hang on one second. I got to check something. I just realized I have a little delay. All right, last but not least, we've got a couple of statements here that need to be added in. Hang on one second. Let me make sure it's turned on. My bad. Sorry, I had to step away for a little bit. But in terms of the effect of this middle class management education, pushing people off the farms, moving people around, one of the things it's creating a change in the attitudes of family. Separate spheres concept. Spheres. Basically states men are superior outside the home, women are superior inside the home. These concepts are best kind of understood as we start to see this middle class emerging at the time period. What's going to happen is your birth rate's going to go down. Birth rate goes down. You're also going to see a change in the age of marriage. Marriage is going to go up. And that's a consequence that's going to have an effect on a lot of people. Outside the home, a lot of people are joining up voluntary associations. A vertical allegiance, just think of it like this. Allegiance. Oh, that's terrible. Gotta learn how to write. A vertical allegiance, look at it like this on a line where you start off at the bottom as the worker, and then you might become an apprentice, and then eventually, if you're good enough over time, you might become the owner of the business or the property. That's kind of like the way a family works. Parents in charge, kids are going to follow the rules of the father and the mother, and that's kind of the idea behind that. What's changing now is that you're starting to see a idea about something on this line, the horizontal, of course. And the horizontal allegiance is changing the way we think about each other. So on this, now we've got this nice, straight, horizontal line like this. And what you start seeing happening here are people from, let's say we have a association, like for instance a religion, or let's say it's a job, or let's say it's a society of some sort like the Rotary Club. What you have is people along the line from all different walks of life, and what starts happening, of course, is that this guy might be rich, this guy might be middle, and this gal over here might be poor. But what's unique is they all relate to each other because they're all relating in a different way. Now this is interesting because what de Tocqueville kind of mentioned and saw is that no matter what, we tend to blend really nicely with each other as a culture. And the other thing about it is that you start to see organizations form regarding that blending. Organizations, and these organizations are going to take on issues, and the issues later on, they're going to be significant, of course, are the ones that really are controversial. So this is a pretty interesting chapter. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope that it helps you understand a little bit better.